Hi everyone, welcome to our second presentation of Spring Semester March On series. Last week we discussed the ongoing situation in Libya, and this week we are focusing on another significant issue that has been in the news lately, which is the ongoing situation in Armenia. Armenia recently went through a devastating 6-week war with neighboring Azerbaijan over the Artsakh, or otherwise known as Nagorno-Karabakh region. The loss of this horrific war has left Armenia at crossroads, and the political crisis in the country is escalating. So today we will be discussing and focusing on these issues. Today I have the distinct honor of introducing our guest speakers, three outstanding academics from the American University of Armenia in Yerevan. Our first speaker is Dr. Yevgenya Paturyan, who specializes and has interest in the sphere of civil society, political culture, volunteering, democratization of post-communist countries, and corruption. She received her PhD in political science from Jacobs University in Bremen, Germany. Prior to joining AUA, she worked at Eurasia Partnership Foundation and at a Caucasus Resource Center in Armenia. And our second speaker today is Dr. Vahram Ter-Matevosyan, who specializes in Turkish domestic and foreign policy, regional security, and conflicts in the post-Soviet space. He has received his doctorate degree in philosophy from the University of Bergen in Norway, master's degree from Lund University in Sweden. He was visiting professor at Duke University and a Fulbright scholar at University of California, Berkeley. And our third speaker today is Dr. Asbed Kochikian. Dr. Kochikian received his undergraduate degree in political science and public administration from the American University of Beirut, after which he continues his graduate studies at Boston University, obtaining his PhD in 2008. He joined AUA after a 12-year of teaching at the Global Studies Department at Bentley University. So today our program will consist of initial presentations by our guest speakers, which will be followed by a discussion and a Q&A portion. Please feel free to ask your questions in the Q&A box or use the raise your hand function. I would like to thank everyone again, and especially our guest speakers. And at this time, I will yield the floor to our first speaker, Dr. Paturyan.
Thank you. Thanks for organizing this, and thanks for joining this discussion. So I was asked to give a bit of an overview of the crisis of democracy in Armenia right now, and perhaps time permitting, give a sense of, public mood in the country. So in order to understand what is happening in Armenia right now from the political science point of view, rather than purely emotional point of view, one needs to go a little bit back in history. And first thing that I want to explain to people is that, after Soviet Union collapsed, Armenia was kind of like a neither nor, a hybrid regime, which was not a full-fledged authoritarian country, of course, but it wasn't a fully democratic country either. It was characterized as a hybrid or semi-authoritarian, kind of like stuck in between, as most of former Soviet states, they either went back to authoritarianism or they just kind of got stuck. And that's what Armenia was. And in 2015, it passed a referendum and it passed a new constitution, which changed Armenia from being a semi-presidential to being a parliamentary democracy. And this constitution, when you pass a constitution, there is like a grace period of transition, which took place until 2018. And that is actually when, basically, the moment the new constitution kicked in and Armenia became a fully parliamentary system, also coincided with, the former president renegating on his promise, becoming the prime minister, and the Velvet Revolution starts. So the picture that you saw on your flyer is from the Velvet Revolution, kind of. And that was a popular uprising by the people, who basically, it was kind of like against this particular person who was a president for 2 terms and then used the constitutional change to remain in power and become a prime minister. So it was kind of like an anti-government protest. Was, to me, was a good thing. It was a genuine people power kind of textbook example of a peaceful uprising that removes a government that people got fed up with. A lot of that was kind of around a corruption narrative and basically, enough is enough. It's time for you to go. We want a new start. And that's how the current embattled government of Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan came into power. So two things, right? A, we have a relatively new constitution that hasn't really been tested so far. Yeah, what does it even mean to be a parliamentary system? What's the function of the parliament in a parliamentary system? What's the function of prime minister? What's the function of a president who's a symbolic figure, sort of like Queen of Britain, right? That's one. Second, 2 years ago, we had that, popular uprising that seemed to signal democratization in Armenia. There were big hopes that this is a reset. The country that was kind of stuck in between is now finally moving towards democracy. But the person who came to power, Nikol Pashinyan, and his, whether it's even can be called political party is a question, had overwhelming legitimacy, 80% of the popular vote, fully controlled the parliament, made huge promises, this kind of romanticization. Armenia was hailed as the beacon of hope, because you might know that in the world, by and large, there is now a reversal of democratization. There is like a global authoritarian wave happening, and Armenia was, like, against that background, one of the few countries actually democratizing. Its anti-corruption record spiked, like we're doing so well in that, and then this and that. And a big point in that revolutionary agenda was also dealing with the constitutional court, because it was seen, I emphasize the word, as like, well, you do a revolution, but there are pockets of old powers left in the system. The constitutional court came under a lot of criticism, as these are the old guards. They were appointed by the previous government. They side with the previous government. So there was push to dismiss some of the judges and basically revolutionize the constitutional court as well. And another point was the transitional justice. The wealth that has been taken from people needs to be given back. Now, again, it's a beautiful slogan, but what does that realistically mean? Yeah? How do you prove that this manor was built based on stolen money and this modest private house wasn't? So there was a lot of, like, rhetoric and excitement, but also, the old government felt very embattled, because someone's coming after their amassed wealth. They're constantly being accused of corruption and plunder and this and that. So it was tense. What I'm trying to say was it was tense. And then the war broke out, and then the country suffered a defeat. The prime minister had to sign a fairly humiliating capitulation, let's put it that way, and immediately calls for his resignation resulted. And yes, a government that messed up that badly, I mean, it's hard to imagine a bigger mess up than losing a war. In many countries, that would mean you resign, right? And not in Armenia, because, again, we have an untested constitution. We have a hyper-personalized politics. We have a prime minister who sees himself as a spokesperson for the revolution. Yeah, so if he resigns, the promises of the revolutions are gone. No one else is gonna take forward that agenda, and that's the tragedy. A true tragedy in Armenia is this personified politics. So he's been asked to resign by a number of groups, academics, universities, and most recently and most powerfully, the Armenian General Staff of the Armed Forces. The opposition has mobilized, but hasn't really, as someone who studies social movements and demonstrations, I think they're pathetic. I'm sorry, they're just pathetic. And it's getting more pathetic by the day. That call for a resignation was, of course, qualified as a military coup attempt, which it's not. If it was a military coup, the military would be in the streets. But Pashinyan reacted very strongly and said, no military coup in Armenia, called his own party. Enough people came out to support him. So it's a standoff. And that standoff plays on the kind of in the background of a new unclear constitution. And things go back and forth between who can do this and who should do that. So Pashinyan was called to resign for the past, I don't know how many months. He's not resigning, clearly. He has no intention to resign. With the last call from the army, he dismissed the chief of the general staff of the army, right? That dismissal goes to the president. The president doesn't sign it. The president sends it to the constitution. So if it wasn't so tragic for me as an Armenian, it would have been very interesting for a political scientist to see how these new institutions now have to take shape in a very serious political crisis. So it's a test drive. Unfortunately, again, we have talks about changing the constitution without even understanding why the constitution is important and why you have to let it work for at least 10, 15 years and go for those kinds of crises before starting to yell at a good constitution. So it's, you know, it's a very sad place to be right now because of so many state institutions crumble, so many politicians act in such an irresponsible way. They just want to like shut it all off. And the last thing I kind of like, this is very unscientific, but I can't help bringing this analogy. If you think of and it's very unscientific, okay? Don't. If you think of a country as a person, 30 years is not much. So Armenian Third Republic, the current Republic of Armenia, you could think of it as a child, and I think now it's gone from being a child to being a very annoying teenager. And that's how they act now. Like I can't explain it any other way. And if it was such a difficult childhood, the teenagehood is going to be hard. So next 30 years are not going to be easy for this country, I think. So that in a nutshell is the deep, deep political crisis. And all of this is kind of juxtaposed to people that are tired, common people, if there is such a thing as common people. Of course, that's a very populist slogan, but to the extent you could talk about an average Armenian hike and Anush, I would say people are tired. They are, of course, you know, the pain and the trauma of losing a war and a trauma of losing this democratic myth and a realization that we have a state that's a lot weaker than we thought. And they're just disengaged. They're just like, yeah, Paturyan gather the crowd, yeah, opposition gather some crowd, but by and large, people are like, the hell with you, leave us alone, I think. And I've just seen a survey data actually today, and it kind of speaks to that. Now that when asked what would you do if there were elections, about 30% would actually vote for Paturyan still. But about 50%, 40-something% said no one. You know, we're so fed up with all of them. And that's kind of okay. It's not a happy place to be in, but it is what it is. So that's where we are in a nutshell. And yeah, if there is a way forward, then obviously elections need to happen. The government needs to have the political will to call elections, and they have to get their act together and have to have enough guts to call for elections. And so that's the discussion now. Should this government organize elections, or you know, the opposition says no, they should resign, we should form a government of consent and then organize elections. It's teenagers mentality, teenagers behavior. It's very sad, but it is what it is. So that's where we are. That's the deep democratic crisis in Armenia right now.
Thank you, Dr. Paturyan, for your initial remarks, and I can turn the floor to Dr. Ter-Matevosyan at this time.
Well, thank you very much, Natalie. Thank you and Petros for organizing this event. What I want to do, I want to concentrate on three things in my 10 minutes that I'm allocated. So the first thing I want to discuss is a Karabakh conflict. The second is Armenian-Turkish relations, and the other one is where does Azerbaijan stand nowadays since November last year. So the Karabakh conflict. Now, one of the frequently discussed statement in Azerbaijan since the end of the war is that the war is over. The Karabakh conflict is resolved. No, that's not true, and there is no evidence, credible evidence, to believe that this is what happened. So what happened basically last year on November 10th, the ceasefire announcement was made. And why I'm choosing my words carefully, because there is a big debate about the legality of this trilateral statement that was signed via Zoom, or Armenia's representative Paturyan was not present during the signing ceremony. Aliyev was rejoicing the moment. Putin was tired, and he just wanted to get rid of the situation. He just wanted to get the things done, and Paturyan was nowhere to be seen. So, from legal standpoint, there are serious concerns about the correspondence of the signed ceasefire announcement to the international agreements, especially the Vienna Conventions of International Agreements. So if that was an international agreement, according to Armenia's constitution, that had to go to the constitutional court in order to decide the legality. But that was not an agreement. So it was ceasefire announcement. And for that reason, one of the first things that Aliyev tried to talk about was the argument about, yes, we congratulate the people of Azerbaijan, we won the war. No, they won the battle. The war will be over when there will be a peace agreement. And that peace agreement to happen, for that, a lot of efforts need to be invested. The peace doesn't come so easily in this troubled region. And you don't, it's easy to expect a peace, but you have to make that peace happen. Now, what happened, what we have after 45 days of bloody war, we have around 5,000 soldiers killed, unspecified number of prisoners of war and captives, unknown number of injured soldiers and civilians who were affected by the war. The government of Artsakh is talking about 40,000 refugees or people who were affected by the war. And again, these are all very approximate numbers. So one of the problems that this government of Armenia is having hard time to disclosing is the real number of the people who have been really affected by this war, and that's a problem from a number of perspectives. So one of the big problems now that Armenian diplomacy is trying to deal with is a question of the status of Nagorno-Karabakh. If the status of Nagorno-Karabakh, if the negotiations for resolving the Nagorno-Karabakh before September 2020 was pretty straightforward negotiations. It was the negotiations were about the three aspects of that was international recognition of Azerbaijan's territorial integrity and right for self-determination, plus non-use of force. Now the entire concept, the philosophy, the foundation, the premises of the negotiations have changed beyond recognition. And now Azerbaijan doesn't want to talk about the status. If before the war they were talking about their preparedness to give Nagorno-Karabakh the highest autonomous status possible, now they are saying, well, no, it's not the time. We don't want to talk about the status of Nagorno-Karabakh. So the status of revolving the negotiations is in target topic number one for Armenia's diplomacy. And I have to say there is not much feedback coming from Azerbaijan about their willingness to sit down and negotiate about about the conflict, about the status of Nagorno-Karabakh. So when I say Nagorno-Karabakh, we should understand that at least 20%, 50% of the Nagorno-Karabakh Autonomous Oblast, the status that Nagorno-Karabakh had until the collapse of the Soviet Union, 50% of that territory is now under the control of Azerbaijan armed forces, including Shushi and Hadrut regions, which are strategically and historically, symbolically essential regions for not only for Nagorno-Karabakh, but also for the Armenian nation. So the other question that is a matter of discussion is the status of Russian peacekeepers in Nagorno-Karabakh. And that question, it will be coming back again and again. Once we have more geopolitics involved, it seems there are countries who are interested in understanding what is the status of Russian peacekeepers. So Russian peacekeepers are there for 5 years plus 5 years. This is what the mandate that they have, but it can be prolonged. So, but the status of peacekeepers, no UN mandate. They don't have any UN mandate. They don't have any OSCE mandate. So it's a problem of mandate that the peacekeepers have to, that Russia has to deal with in the coming years or even months. So that's about the Karabakh conflict, more or less where we stand now. The other question is about Armenian-Turkish relations, like I said. So from 1991, Turkish position concerning Nagorno-Karabakh conflict and Turkish-Armenian relations were combined. Turkey tied Nagorno-Karabakh negotiations and Nagorno-Karabakh conflict and Armenian-Turkish relations in one context and saying, basically putting a precondition against Armenia, saying if Armenia wants to normalize relations with Turkey and open the border, Armenia has to, there needs to be progress in the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. Now, they have been saying repeatedly for 30 years, now the conflict is, according to Azerbaijan, is resolved. Azerbaijan is saying we are not against establishing diplomatic relations between Armenia and Turkey, yet Turkey is not making any bold moves of establishing diplomatic relations and opening the border, even though Armenian foreign minister said 3 weeks ago that the obstacles, and I'm quoting him, the obstacles which existed before for normalizing relations between Armenia and Turkey is now are now gone. Armenia is ready to normalize relations. So, but again, Turkey is speaking again with conditionalities, more or less with formulas like if Armenia continues to behave in a normal way, more or less I'm quoting Çavuşoğlu, the foreign minister of Turkey, then we will be able to normalize relations with Armenia. So again, we see Turkish conditionality while dealing with Armenia. And the last point, where does Azerbaijan stand? What are strategic objectives? Obviously, Azerbaijan was caught by surprise. The way and the speed they achieved their strategic objectives. I think at the beginning of the war, even in their wildest dreams, it was not possible to imagine that the Armenian army was going to have such, to display such resistance. But of course, there were many problems the way the Armenian army behaved. I guess it still fought heroically, especially in the northern part of Nagorno-Karabakh. They did some heroic deeds that we are the bits and pieces of which which are just emerging. Now what happened now, what Azerbaijan is saying is their first priority now is to make sure that there is a corridor linking linking Azerbaijan proper to exclave Nakhichevan. So this is their obsession number one now. Basically the formula is the following one: as long as Armenia is shaking, the domestic stability in Armenia is not stable, Aliyev is pushing and 2 days ago, he even admitted that if there is a need, Azerbaijan can enforce militarily that Armenia agrees on the corridor, which is basically 40 something kilometer that it will connect Azerbaijan proper to Nakhichevan exclave. So the other thing is they are making contacts, trying to make contacts with the population of Nagorno-Karabakh. So this is another interesting initiative. So I think Azerbaijan government is thinking one step ahead. They are showing signs which were not there before. I guess these are new tools in their toolbox. And as the time passes, we'll see new manifestations of their projection of power in the region. They are making also the last point that I want to make, that Azerbaijan still displays force. There are, since the end of the since November 10th, they had already 3 military drills. The third one will be soon, which is another manifestation of power. And there is no indication that Azerbaijan is really interested as of now to speak about peace, about coexistence, about regional cooperation platforms. Yes, I guess once again the war is not over. It's the battle which is over. There is a long way to go before uncertainty is reduced. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much for this insightful presentation. And at this time, I will yield the floor to Dr. Kochikian for his presentation.
Thank you, Natalie. I'm just going to build upon what Jenny and what Vahram talked upon, but situate the whole, the context, create a context in geopolitics. Vahram already talked about the two neighbors, East and West. I would like to just paint the overall picture and offer some concepts or some understanding as to where does, what are the countries thinking. Of course, you know, we claim that politics, we have a political science. It's far from being an absolute science. It's more based on educated speculations and evaluations and understanding. So obviously, I actually had to order in a bit different as to which one to start with, but I guess I'm going to start with Russia, obviously the main player in this context. Vahram already talked about the peacekeepers, the Russian peacekeepers in Nagorno-Karabakh, in Artsakh. And a couple of things I think need to be mentioned here. First of all, there was and there is still a misconception that the war, when it started, Russia was caught off guard, which I don't share at all. I don't think Russia was caught off guard. They knew that something was going to happen and they were ready, of course, for any contingency. But more importantly, probably this would have been the perfect opportunity for Russia to have boots on the ground in one of the only, or not one of the only post-Soviet space conflict where they didn't have boots on the ground. If you look at the other conflicts, the more sort of obvious ones, Abkhazia and South Ossetia, but also Transnistria, they're, you know, Russian and Ukraine, you know, Eastern Ukraine. The Russians never had a presence in Nagorno-Karabakh. And this was actually something that both Armenia and Azerbaijan were not willing to have up until the war. Now, that being said, I think Russian peacekeeping forces in Nagorno-Karabakh, I can't remember who mentioned it in a talk recently, or I might have read it somewhere, but it's peacekeeping on steroids. It's like beyond peacekeeping, right? It's not just about defensive weapons, which I always have the problem understanding about defensive weapons versus an offensive weapon, but they have gone beyond what the peacekeeping force should be providing. That includes also preparing a supply line, also setting up sort of checkpoints, but also setting up barracks and so on and so forth. So I think Russia, other than Turkey and Azerbaijan, is sort of the biggest winner, or the third biggest winner in this war, by having presence on the ground. I'm not going to go into details. We can explore that in Q&A depending what the attendees would be more interested in understanding. But moving to the southern border, I think Iran has been an enigma. Iran's position has been an enigma. Iran in itself is an enigma. I think Winston Churchill's sort of rephrasing what he had said about Russia. Iran is an enigma shrouded in a mystery, wrapped in a secret. But Iran has a long-term view. And one thing that this war and the post-war, not the peace, as Vahram mentioned, we're not talking about the peace, but this is the post-war period, is that Iran has been, quote unquote, allowed to be a player, direct player, that it was denied for the longest time in the last 20, 30 years, mostly by the United States. As a neighbor, Iran has always been concerned about what's happening in Azerbaijan and in Armenia, considering that there is a large ethnic Azeri population in Iran, so the spillover effect has always been concerned. But the fact that this conflict actually has de facto been removed from the Euro-Atlantic OSCE Minsk process, where the United States and Europe, along with Russia, had a say, to a completely regional context, where Russia, Turkey, and to a lesser extent, Iran have a say in it. I think I don't know how this would translate into the outlook of the conflict, where it has been a more regional-based sort of focus or regional-based context for the conflict, finding possible solutions for the conflict. But I think this is something to keep in mind. Iran's shuttle diplomacy and their presence in the region. Just last month, Iran's foreign minister visited Baku, visited Nakhichevan, Yerevan, Tbilisi, and Moscow, as well as Ankara, shows that this is a way for Iran to flex its muscles. Now, that being said, what about the West? Everyone talks about the West. I just remembered, I was thinking about Georgia, the country, and one of the things I remember having written about it is that Georgia has always waited for the West to come as a savior. And it always brings the analogy of waiting for Godot, and the part where, everyone is waiting for Godot, Sam Beckett's play, where everyone's waiting for Godot, but Godot doesn't come. So does the West arrive here? And which West are we talking about? And in this context, it's important that one of the reasons why the war precipitated when it did is, to a large extent, U.S. disengagement from the world scene under President Trump, but also because of the pandemic. More so in the case of Europe, where the pandemic has actually been more of a focal point, and the region itself has been relegated to secondary, tertiary role or importance in the region. So by looking at this, it's quite interesting to see whether or not the timing of the war was considered, or all of these were considered or not. Again, we can't go into the minds of people, but the evidence shows that that's what it is. Sometimes we create correlations and causations where there are none, but sometimes the obvious is also there. Paraphrasing what Sherlock Holmes says, if you eliminate all the possible answers, whatever improbable answer remains, that must be the right answer, sort of. But Europe, I think, to a large extent, as much as Russia is trying to keep the OSCE Minsk process, not killing it, let's call it that way. And Sergei Lavrov during the war actually mentioned several times that we are willing to work within the OSCE, but at the same time without the OSCE process. But Russia never sort of removed it. And this raises the question as to what role, if any, the West would play. And this goes back to what I said earlier as to the context of resolving or talking about the conflict now is more in the hands of it has become more regional rather than Euro-Atlantic OSCE. So it is within this context, the changing context, that matters. We have to also situate the domestic issues as well as the trilateral or bilateral Armenia-Azerbaijan, Armenia-Turkey context. One thing I want to add in this context, that as a defeated side in this war, And it was interesting, Jenny, talking about Armenia being a teenager, a rowdy teenager, sort of. For me, one of the things that keeps coming to my mind is that Nagorno-Karabakh remained under Soviet rule, on Soviet context, for 2.5 generations, under Armenian control for a generation. And now we're entering a phase, an unknown phase, as to what it would be, how long would it be in this sort of in limbo or frozen. It's still frozen, you know, it's like it was thawed, but then it was frozen again. Probably that might be an approach as well to look at it. But tying this to the domestic context, one of the things I would like to end mentioning, I would like to end my thoughts by mentioning this, is that now you have an Armenian leadership, a prime minister who's completely dependent on Russia and Russia's support. And the domestic component of nothing moving forward might to a large extent be related to the fact that as Russia has a strong grip on Prime Minister Pashinyan, he's still needed for whatever reason, as Vahram also mentioned, to sign deals, to be someone that as a quote-unquote reliable partner, but not by choice. And this in itself might have an impact on the domestic political processes. The moment Russia might indicate, Moscow might indicate that, okay, buddy, you've done your job, we don't need you, the whole political sort of dynamic might be reanimated. And that is something to keep an eye on. And these are more questions. I know most people like to have answers, definitive answers, but I don't think any one of us is ready to give any answers, just raising the right questions or questions to keep an eye on. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your insightful presentation. And at this time, I would like to remind our attendees that they can send their questions in the Q&A box. And I see that we already have questions. And before turning to the Q&A function, I personally have a question, and I have a lot of questions from your very interesting presentation. And one thing that I've been thinking about, especially since the start of the war, is why hasn't Armenia in the last 30 years kind of pushed its military campaign as Azerbaijan has? Because with Azerbaijan, we saw that they had a very aggressive buildup of the military in the last 30 years, especially after the defeat in the 91 war. And were we under the false presumption that we're always going to win the war? Or anyone, please free to jump in, and if you have any thoughts on that.
Yes, so let me take that question, because that's the most logical question that you have to, anyone comes up with while looking at the results of this war. When we are talking about modernization of the defense and security, we always have to talk about the financial resources that Armenia and Azerbaijan had. And the entire military doctrine of Armenia was based on the premises of purchasing defensive weapons, being in the cooperation or in security military alliance with Russia, and that was a collective security treaty organization. Armenia was hoping that being in the same military alliance with Russia, it would provide enough security guarantees for Azerbaijan to stay away from military alliance, military operation against Armenia, against Nagorno-Karabakh. So that was one way to balance Azerbaijan's military buildup. But since 2016, we see that Azerbaijan, since 2013, once Azerbaijan had a new Minister of Defense, Azerbaijan has changed its policy dramatically. It was about acquiring new technologies and modernizing the army in an unprecedented way. And of course, one of the ways to do that was try to compete with Armenia in a way that Armenians were not paying enough attention, and that were aerial offense. And this is where the drones came into play, and they made a huge, significant difference in the battlefield. The other one was, of course, intelligence. And we're talking not only about human intelligence, but also signal intelligence. Azerbaijan has been investing a lot in acquiring satellites, which back in the days, many in Armenia were, like analysts, were thinking that this is a waste of time. But there were a few analysts were saying this is serious, pay attention to this, because if Azerbaijan has aerial intelligence, this is going to change the situation. And plus to that, Azerbaijan also had the support, unconditional support of Turkey and Pakistan and Ukraine. And Azerbaijan has been able to build military, technological, and diplomatic alliance with a number of countries which provided unconditional support. So, of course, if Azerbaijan was, but in spite of these, Armenia understood the importance of acquiring more weapons in 2017 when there was when there was an approved purchased program for $1.5 billion. And some of them were already purchased, these weapons. These were anti-missile defense system weapons that Armenia purchased. But because of the change of government in 2018, the new government decided that there is no need to buy these weapons. And the prime minister, with his populist mindset, he had a completely different preferences, and he bought these Su-30 fighter jets, advanced jets without any missiles attached, set of unwise decisions, which led to military balance being shifted largely to Azerbaijan's advantage. And once there was a balance, Azerbaijan had to do what it planned to do. If Azerbaijan had to do this, let's say in May this year, the circumstances would have been completely different. So it was the right moment militarily once the balance was shifted drastically to their advantage. So it was not only about what Armenia wanted, but also about the military and financial resources that Armenia could possess in order to fight the war and maintain the balance with Azerbaijan.
Thank you very much for this great informative answer. And I see that we have a lot of questions in the Q&A function, and I will get to the first question, which is, why do you think Georgia, being Armenia's neighbor, did not support Armenia? If they supported Armenia, what difference do you think it would make for the result of the war? And feel free, anyone, if you'd like to address the question.
I'll take it if it's okay with the others. It's just, you know, one of the things is we tend to oversimplify regions. We think that just because countries are in a region, they might have similar approaches, similar concerns, similar sort of threat perceptions, or overplay the fact that, you know, culture, in this case, you know, two small nations surrounded by quote unquote enemies and whatnot. But at the end of the day, realpolitik is what matters, right? Georgia, by default, would have never been able to support Armenia's position by just the simple fact that if they were to support Armenia, the two principles in international sort of law, and this is in the UN Charter, by the way, they're separated by 1 or 2 articles. One is territorial integrity, the other one, the right for self-determination. So Armenia's push was always about right of self-determination, Azerbaijan territorial integrity. And Georgia has Abkhazia and South Ossetia. If it were to accept it, they would actually means that they agree with Armenia and that they would lose their own claim on their land. I think Georgia's role might not have been whatever, even if by some miracle they had actually said, yeah, we're going to support Armenia, whatever, we're going to stop all shipments and so on, it wouldn't have made much of a difference. Because again, there are so many different ways to get the equipment that they needed, the flying, the drones and so on and so forth. I don't think it would have made any difference. And one thing I forgot to mention, by the way, is that we talked geopolitics, but we forgot, I forgot Georgia. But this is an interesting time for Georgia as well, regionally, as to what extent would Georgia be still relevant in the region, whereas up until the war, they could be the link between Azerbaijan and Turkey and between Russia and Armenia. Now that role is not there anymore, or it's diminished, let's put it that way. Nothing new came in its place, but it is potentially diminished. I don't think Georgia, they were wary, I have to say, you know, they were quite wary about what's happening, about the spillover effect and so on and so forth. But Georgia has its own issues to focus on, and Georgia's orientation is completely, political orientation is completely sort of not aligned with the region. As weird as it might sound, Armenia and Azerbaijan might have more things in common when it comes to perceptions of neighbors and so on than Georgia. So that might be considered Georgia being the odd man out in this case. Just a simple, probably.
If I may add here, Natalie, because that's a very important question and not very much discussed, the context that for people who are keeping a close eye on the region developments, this is a small community of people are talking about this. So what Georgia did was a very difficult choice for Georgia during the war. There was too much pressure from the Armenian side not to allow the transportation of military equipment and air transportation, or using the air corridor that Georgia provided. But where this is coming from, we have to understand that since 2007, Azerbaijan and Turkey slowly but steadily were taking control over a number of critical areas and infrastructures within Georgia. So Georgia was slowly dragged into the orbit of influence of Turkey and Azerbaijan. So I have written extensively on this topic about the Turkish soft power politics in Georgia, Azerbaijani soft power politics in Georgia, a number of critical infrastructure that they have acquired over the years. And as a result, there is this trilateralism that has been built in the South Caucasus between Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Turkey. In 2012, the Trabzon Declaration was adopted between these three countries. And according to this declaration, Georgia had agreed to have military and foreign policy consultations with Azerbaijan and Turkey. Moreover, over the last few years, there were a number of military drills, joint military drills organized that were held with the armed forces of these three countries. So Georgia was sort of pushed into this, and early enough, Georgia's National Security Council adopted into the war. Into the recent war, Georgia's National Security Council took a deliberate position not to support any party during the war. But given the evidence, given the footages, given the signal intelligence that we have been receiving from Georgia, Georgia did provide aerial corridor to Azerbaijan. So all the Turkish planes, they're flying over the territory of Georgia to go to Baku, to land, and then could go back to bring more drones, more mercenaries and terrorists that have been reportedly sent to Azerbaijan to fight against Armenia. So Georgia could have been a little bit more balanced during the war, but unfortunately they are dragged into too many commitments in front of Turkey and Azerbaijan, and it's not easy for them to say no.
Thank you very much. And I have the next question for Dr. Paturyan. So Dr. Paturyan earlier mentioned that, you know, Armenia has entered this revolutionary moment, or as some can consider a democratic transition process. You know, I think there's a lot of work to do to get to the revolutionary moment. So maybe Armenia is in a democratic transition process. And In this process, we've seen, internal divisions that you spoke about, the opposition to the current government, and we saw protests breaking in the streets of Yerevan supporting the prime minister, and also the opposition as well. So in this context, we saw that Nikol Pashinyan called for earlier election. And do you think that the earlier elections are going to be a plausible solution to the demands of the opposition?
Absolutely. It's the only solution. It's the only way out. There's no other way. And of course, what worries me is that, people say, oh, the elections are going to be stolen. And that's a stupid thing to say. First of all, there is a good international practice, innocent until proven guilty. You can't assume, you can be worried, you can be concerned. And so the answer to that is let's work together to make sure they're not stolen. There are good mechanisms and practices in place. Mobilize enough observers and watch every step and check every piece of paper and have cameras everywhere possible and ask Armenian people to give up a little bit of their privacy if that's needed. But let's goddamn organize elections at the best. Let's organize stellar elections for the whole world to say, wow, this is the cleanest election ever, right? But to sit here and say, oh, we don't trust elections before anything even started is a completely irresponsible thing to do. It shows me that these people are just afraid to go into elections. And rightly so, because as I said, when I just saw public opinion data, nobody's going to vote for these folks. They get like 3%, 5%. It's Pashinyan or nobody. That's the choice. So that's a silly argument to say, oh, we don't want to, of course you don't want elections tomorrow. You want to give a deadline. You're going to say 4 months from now, 4 months from now, enough, half a year from now, enough time for everyone to get their act together, get organized, make the best possible, transparent, heavily observed elections. That is the only way out of this mess we're having right now. But the people who know they're going to lose elections are now yelling about this is not going to be, and they're going to do the same. Even if you organize the cleanest election possible, sore losers are going to stand out there and cry fault and say the elections were stolen. The good news, however, is that if you do organize good elections with transparent observation, people get a sense, people get a sense whether or not this has been completely stolen or not. It's a tiny country. You can't hide things and you can't lie to people. If elections get stolen, the stories fly around about, guys in black suits coming in and stealing the box. If they're not stolen, then it's hard to fake in a country like Armenia. So that's what we need. We need now to announce when elections are going to happen. We do need, I'd say, at least maybe 4 or 5 months, maybe even more. There are good arguments why we need time before we organize elections, but we can't let it hang in the air any longer. We have to say elections in this many months, everybody start getting ready. And there's a lot of international support that will come for these elections. Yeah? There's a lot of international organizations standing ready saying, you want the same, Asbed was talking about the West. That's what they can do. And I'm sure they will. There's a lot of goodwill to help Armenia get out of this mess. And
there's precedence. There's also precedence, Jenny. I mean, in the previous elections, the EU, usually not the EU, but the UN consortium of different groups under the UN consortium, they actually have always worked with elections. And one thing,
Moreover, as someone who studies civil society, I can say the Armenian local independent election observation tradition has grown pretty strong. Local Armenian observers, independent citizens who are just citizens, responsible folks saying, I'll come sign up. Transparency International in Armenia is doing a very good job putting together election observations. That's what we should be working on.
And Jenny mentioned earlier in her talk about the recent poll by the IRI, I think, right, about what the people think about who they're going to vote. Interestingly, like the plurality of people, 40% or so, they said they're not going to vote for anyone. But there was a question as to voter turnout. People are still not apathetic. They want to go and elect. So the correlation here is that you have so many people who want to participate, but they don't like any of them. So this is one thing that if instead of BSing your way and speaking on behalf of people, you have 40%, 50% of undecided voters. So how do you prepare them? And luckily, the elections didn't happen as soon as after the war, because with the heightened tension, those could have been excuses for bloodshed, to fight and so on and so forth. So that's the other thing. It's just about postponing the inevitable, but with a parliamentary system, that's the good thing, right? You can have snap elections whenever you want to, or whatever the parliament decides. It's not like fixed presidential elections. So definitely could help the country to move forward.
Perfect, thank you so much. And maybe just a follow-up question, maybe we can quickly address it, is that with after the war especially, we saw older political figures emerging back into the political sphere. We saw the second president, Robert Kochikian, coming like doing a comeback, and also Sargsyan going on TV and giving an interview. And do you think that Armenia maybe has an issue with like leadership and people, instead of having like ideas stand behind personalities and versus ideas? And maybe could you please address that briefly?
I just want to say, and I think Jenny should respond to this as well. I'm not saying that Vahram shouldn't, but recently paraphrasing a former advisor of mine who's a Georgia specialist, and he was talking about politics in Georgia. He said politics in Georgia is about personalities, grudges, and fixations. It's not about ideas. And I think that can easily be applied. This is my paraphrase of what he had said, but it was the same gist. I think that's the gist of the idea. And I think in Armenia, that's definitely also applicable. And it goes back to sort of answering the question as to, yes, there is a lack of leadership with ideas. It's about the personalities, it's about the grudges, and it's about the fixations that politicians have. But I think Jenny or Vahram might have a different perspective on this.
Thank you.
Yeah, let me say a few words about this aspect, and three observations. First of all, what Jenny said is correct, and I want to add to that. First is Armenia's political system is still in the making. While there were some traditions set within the previous constitutional system of government, but the new government is supposed to be based primarily on the political parties. Political parties, according to the parliamentary system of government, is a foundation of parliamentary system of government. Whereas now we have a situation when we don't have political parties as such, which with broad constituency, with structures. These are political parties based on personality. So politics is always personalized, of course, we know that. But in the Armenian system is more than that. So political party system is still in its infancy. I have to say the government system, the shifting from to the parliament system was designed to boost the party system in Armenia, but it failed miserably as of now. I have to say that Armenia has around 115 political parties. How about that? 115 in a small country like this. And with every month we have a new party emerging. As we speak, today there was another political party that emerged. Of course, they can declare about the establishment of the political party, but the Ministry of Justice has to register them. So there's certain process that they have to go through. Now, concerning the question, the previous political leaders are emerging, I have to say the following. Armenia is the only post-Soviet state where all the former leaders are alive. That's a big deal. And in a country like Armenia, where all the political leaders were somehow connected to the Karabakh war, they cannot sit silent and not to say anything about the Karabakh conflict. That's just not acceptable. Levon Ter-Matevosyan was a president, was an architect, was a supporter, was a president at least during whom the Karabakh war, the first Karabakh war was won. The second president, third president were from Nagorno-Karabakh. They were personal attachments and they took it very personally. And obviously, Levon Ter-Matevosyan was speaking. He kept the silence for a number of days, and he was criticized. Why are you not speaking up? No, you like it or not, but the Constitution provides certain guarantees to all previous presidents. So Armenia has a very good tradition of providing, first of all, security detail to previous presidents. They have certain protection. The government buys their properties, both properties to all previous presidents. They have their offices, which are politicized platforms, which are making statements over important issues. And the last point, none of those presidents left politics after their term finished. Ter-Matevosyan was out of politics for 10 years, and then he decided to come back. Robert Kochikian was out of politics, even though he was making some statements, and then he decided to come back. Ter-Matevosyan never left politics. He is still the head of the Republican Party. So we have these very personified politicians, really strong, charismatic leaders, these three leaders. And then we have another one, Nikol Pashinyan, creating his own constituency. And we have a situation with no political parties. So very fluid situation in terms of democratic institution making and the rest. So if you have
different mold, isn't it, Vahram? You know, it's interesting that you say, you know, now what we have in the last 2 years, it's a different mold, both in the same system. The system is made up of a different mold. The leadership of the country is from a different mold as well. So it's like the clash of the molds, sort of, in a way.
Thank you for that answer. I really appreciate it. It's very informative for sure. And I mean, I hope we at some point turn to a system where it's based on ideas rather than personalities in order to address this, vacuum of ideas. But I want to give our attendees the chance for their questions to be answered. And I see we have we have a couple of questions in the Q&A box, and one is for Dr. Ter-Matevosyan, and it says, was there an alternative for the Prime Minister? Could the war have been avoided or stopped earlier? And one more question is, Armenia proper at risk today?
Yes, I have to say that we are now completing another research with my colleague, Nikol about the decision-making systems and mechanism in Armenia during the war. And the preliminary findings that we have are pretty scary. We're having discussions with former members of the Security Council, and it seems there have been a series of misjudgments done on the level of Prime Minister about the negotiations, about the decisions. He was informed about the military balance early enough into the war. He could have inform his colleagues, international colleagues, about the existing balance that Armenia needs to stop the war, but yet he decided to fight on. Of course, he claims that Armenia never had the real chance to stop the war, but there is no evidence to back up that claim. More and more new details, pieces are emerging that he could stop the war. At least he was offered, none other than Putin, to stop the war at least on October 19th on better conditions, with Shushi under Armenian control, with Hadrut under Armenian control. Yet he decided to make decisions which were ill-informed, based on ill judgments and some erratic factual base. So the way the Security Council was handled was another disastrous demonstrations how decisions were made on that on that level. So I think yes, there were at least 3 occasions, documented occasions that we know now. In the future, we may hear about the new facts that he could stop the war. And yet he didn't. The second issue, it's difficult to speak about security when, as we speak, the borders of Armenia are being shaped by some unknown, according to some unknown methods. GPS is now the method that defines Armenia's borders. Just imagine that for a second. And unfortunately, this is having a strong psychological impact on the population in the country. Now, I was watching the news. The Russian peacekeepers are now strongly making observation already in the Tavush region, which is in the south north on the northeastern part of Armenia, and they had some medical staff that they went with them to the bordering regions of Tavush region, and people mostly complain about the nervous breakdown. The people living in the border region, they are having problems with their nervous system, and they are going to doctor. Because where this is coming from? We have an army that has deep political divisions with the political leadership. We have an army that has to be built anew from scratch. The system that it was based upon in the previously has basically collapsed. We need a new security system that corresponds to the needs of the 21st century. We need, of course, in these circumstances, people have the right to not feel secure. We have the intelligence system in Armenia, which has serious cracks, as we see number of footages emerging on the net, how Azerbaijani special intelligence forces are infiltrating into Armenia's cities and filming in the cities and then spreading this information in Azerbaijani social media. Of course, that creates anxiety in the population, and they don't feel secure. So all these pieces are put together. You feel that Armenia is going through its deepest political crisis, I would say, since 1920. So last time we were here, it was 100 years ago. So of course, not a joyful and amusing time to live in Armenia. And like Jenny said, if we're not here, it should have been very interesting as a political laboratory of different interesting processes going on. But we live here. I mean, my friends, I have students who live, who are like, who go online in Zoom classes, whereas they have the right a couple of meters away from where the border is now being defined. So not very, very depressing times in Armenia, and also post-traumatic disorder. I guess this is also something that if there was a way to diagnose people in the country, I guess many would just have that diagnosed in that way in the country.
Thank you. And I see we have more questions. And the next question has to do with Russia's role in the Caucasus region. And I think you mentioned this. I will add a little bit to the question by asking, we saw Turkey and Russia both cooperating and competing together in Nagorno-Karabakh region, and not only, in other places such as Libya, Syria, and now on issues of Turkey obtaining a nuclear weapon. Also, we just saw reports today coming out. So what do you see the Turkish-Russian dynamic in the Nagorno-Karabakh region moving forward, as we saw talks between President Erdogan and President Putin talking about opening a center together that would overlook the ceasefire and the agreement moving forward?
Asbed, you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, you can also cover the part of Vahram, I think, about Turkey, but this is the thing about working in binaries, right? You always look at either or. You're either friends or you're enemies. One of the things that has been fascinating me looking at Russian-Turkish sort of interaction, let's put it that way, in different parts of the world, the Mediterranean, Eastern Mediterranean, Syria, and so on, is that it's not binary. In some places, they actually are adversaries. In other places, they cooperate. In other places, their actually interests overlap. So it's to exclusively say that it's either or, it's problematic. Like, for instance, when it comes to foreign policy alignment, they both have anti-Western sort of sentiments, or let's not call it sentiments, but orientations. In Syria, they're adversaries, but they are also instances where they do not actually escalate. One of the more fascinating components of this was that a couple of years ago when a Russian jet fighter was shot down by Turkish forces in northern Syria. Everyone was expecting that this is going to escalate into a war, but then within a couple of months, it was hush-hush. It could have been easily escalated. The same thing happened, by the way, during the Karabakh War, right? In the Artsakh War recently, when a Russian helicopter was shut down. But everyone was like, oh, this is the time where Russia is going to really show its muscles, but not really. So I think it's not. Thinking in terms of binaries or historically, or Russia and Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, they had fought a war every generation, so this is going to be another one. At this point, they have alignments, their interests align. It's about quote-unquote hijacking the regional sort of status quo from, as I said, Euro-Atlantic European sort of sphere into a more regional one, but also as a guarantor. Russia and Turkey as each one being a guarantor for the situation, to keep the status quo on the ground. And that's why you have the observation centers, the military observation outposts, even though up until this point there is an agreement or a reiteration that only Russian peacekeepers are on the ground, and the Turkish army is just observing if everything's in order. So I think it's much more nuanced than that, but clearly at this point in the last couple of months, even before the war, there has been alignment, not an alliance, but an alignment between Moscow and Ankara on many, many issues. So I think that is an important component to keep in mind.
If I can, Natalie, if I can just two
Go ahead.
Two more things. Look, the best way to describe Russian-Turkish relations is a cooperation through competition. Okay. That's the best way how to formulate the relations, because there is not a single place on planet Earth that, especially in this region, where the interests completely align, and there is not a single interest where the interests completely collide. So there is like emerging regional power. Turkey tries to position itself in those areas where it would have been, where it was difficult for Turkey to set a foot like a decade ago. But now, look at the post-Soviet space. There are 6 conflicts active or frozen in the post-Soviet space: Nagorno-Karabakh, Abkhazia, South Ossetia, Donbass, Crimea, and Transnistria. So Turkey is making itself relevant to all these conflicts. And now the first manifestation of this relevance to this conflict is Nagorno-Karabakh. Now Turkey has been dreaming from the early 1990s to send peacekeepers to Nagorno-Karabakh. So they were hoping to do so in the 1990s. It never happened. Russians also couldn't do that. But now it doesn't have a peacekeepers as such, but they have observation mission in Arda. Now, it's in Nagorno-Karabakh, it's in the South Caucasus, the backyard of Russia. So Russians agreed to that. So if Turkey is in the sacred place for Russia's interest in their backyard, the next, I think, is going to be more tensions in Ukraine, in Crimea, in Donbass. So Russians are feeling that. If you look at the Russia's political discourse, Russians are becoming more and more concerned about Turkish soft power, Turkish infiltration into the Russian or information orbit. Russian, especially the nationalists, the right-wing Russian pro-Kremlin news media, they are making claims that this is a time for Russia to be extra careful with Turkey. Turkey is expanding. Turkey is projecting its power beyond its reach. So therefore, Turkish-Russian, like I said, it's a competition. It's a cooperation through competition. It's a very complex relations. These are all anti-Western in their foreign policy rhetoric, in their stance, in their philosophical positioning, but at the same time trying to be pragmatic. So very complex relations, and Armenia doesn't feature very well in that context.
Thank you for your response, and I see we're coming to an end, and I would like to ask a question to all, if maybe you can address this question. What's the biggest challenge you see today, and what's the way you see for Armenia moving forward?
Jenny, you want to start?
Oh yeah, I can try to give a shot at that. For me, again, as someone who studies domestic processes and people and political culture and things like that, I think the biggest challenge is to accept differences. It's normal actually to have different opinions and to accept that and move beyond that. Stop channeling our pain into anger, start channeling it into compassion. And that would, and learn to compromise, for crying out loud, like I can't move beyond that teenager behavior, because they need to compromise. Those inflated egos and hurt personalities, and then that reverberates. It's okay to disagree. It's okay to, like, we in PSIA, for me, are a tiny model of what Armenia should be. We disagree on many things very respectfully, and we still work together for a bigger goal. And so that, yes, the nation is going through a shock, and there's more that unites us than what divides us. What unites us is our pain, our grief, our loss, our worry, our fears, so much. Channel that into listening to it, like compassion. That's what we need to start doing. That's the biggest challenge. And unfortunately, many people channel it into anger. And I don't say we shouldn't blame. People who are responsible should be held responsible, but that reaction of just finding someone to blame all the pain on them and then beating them up, that's just so unhelpful. That's just so unhelpful. For me, that's the biggest challenge. Like, stay calm and just, have compassion for people who don't agree with you and see things different. And that's okay.
Thank you. And Dr. Ter-Matevosyan, if you want to take
Asbed, you may want to say, if I jump in.
Yeah, I mean, with compassion, I think, compassion is everything. But, one of the concerns I see around is regression in terms of rationality, probably as a result of anger, rhetoric of marginalization, dare I say, even nationalism with different manifestations appearing. And I think it's the regression of the political thought in Armenia. And one component here is that usually, as it was manifested in the survey, the recent survey that was there, but a large percentage or large segment of the population is silent, and that doesn't mean that they're indifferent, right? That doesn't mean that they don't care. But the problem is that damned if you do, damned if you don't situation you have in Armenia now. You speak, then you are basically being categorized, pigeonholed. If you don't speak, then you're pigeonholed again. And what happens, or what is left in the field, I think, at least in the public field, we're not talking academic or whatnot, but is rhetoric, and everyone and their grandmother and their grandfather is an expert as to how to solve the problem without actually having any foundational basis on how to do it. And this is, in a way, one of the things, one of the challenges, I think one of the biggest challenges, not necessarily the same idea, but, it has become who is, it's a thumping the chest and, shouting who can shout more. That would be your sort of indicator as how much of an Armenian are you, how much of a patriot are you. And I think this is, in a way, continuing what Jenny said. It's, has to be somehow stopped or diluted in order to see what's next. What's going to happen next? What could happen next?
And Natalie, I guess that's a question that the most difficult question, and that's very difficult to sit down and think about this question. What to do next? That's the most challenging question. And since November 10th, everybody was shocked, but I was shocked in a way how the debate in Armenia was evolving, like blame game that started in Armenia. And I guess for the next 5 generations, we'll be seeing this blame game. Who sold sushi? Who did this and that? So that's a part. But I guess there are 4 things that Armenia has to do, Armenia and Armenians around the world. First, we have to become ruthless pragmatists about our resources, about our interests. That's first. Second, now, in the shortest term, we have to build empathy to the people affected by the war. For the families in the borderline, the fallen soldiers and their families, they feel abandoned. And they, in the sense of insecurity, sense of ignorance, sense of being neglected. These are damaging the national psyche, and I want that to happen. And 2 bigger things first is a new social contract is needed for this country, for our country. Social contract in a way that will be based on some paramount perceptions about the future of this country. Social needs, not about the wishful thinking, but about the very premises of our existence in the country. Social contract between different stakeholders. And the last thing is about rethinking the concept of state building in Armenia. State building, it should start anew. Because we should also think that there is not a single country in the world that hasn't been defeated. Okay, this is horrible. This is painful, but we should remember that there have always been countries that have been defeated, and then they pulled them together and they moved on. So therefore, these big ideas of state building, social contract, and should be the guiding principles. And to do that, we need to do what Jenny, Asbed, and I are doing in this country. We are educating the people, the young generation, who are going to go and change the country that we love so much, and they love so much, and many others love so much, and education on top of this.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, our wonderful discussion has to come to an end, as I know it's very late in Armenia. It's 11 p.m. And I would like to thank our speakers, especially for this wonderful presentation and discussion that we had. I would like to personally thank all of you, Dr. Paturyan, Dr. Ter-Matevosyan, and Dr. Kochikian, for coming on today and giving these wonderful remarks and educating us on an issue that it's very important. And, you know, I hope everything works out in Armenia. I'm from Armenia myself, and the issue is very dear to my heart. And I'd like to thank our attendees as well for asking wonderful questions, and hope to see everyone again at our future events.
Thank
you very much. Thank you.
Yeah.
Have a good afternoon.
You too. Thank you. Have a good night.